Hi, this is Jedi Amanda. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know how you can design and win your very own Bernina Dream Studio. Just check out berninasweepstakes.com. When I designed mine, I had to have that foot tower in there. See for yourself. It was super cool. And get in today to win Bernina's Dream Studio $100,000 giveaway at berninasweepstakes.com. Dream it, design it, win it.
Welcome to So and So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Sarah Joyner, a sewist, knitter, blogger at the Lilac Elk, and teacher from Pennsylvania, where she teaches college students chemistry by day and sews all night. Sarah is passionate about teaching others to sew garments and holds a variety of virtual sewing classes to empower others to make a wardrobe they love. Her blog, The Lilac Elk, started as an Etsy shop and evolved into an Instagram community where she shares her handmade wardrobe journey and other projects along the way. Sarah has a PhD in chemistry from the University of New Hampshire and makes her home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with her spouse, Mark. Sarah, hi, and welcome to So and So.
Hi, Meg. Thank you so much for having me.
You know, in doing the research for our conversation, I found a lot of the things that you do to be very fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hearing your answers to what we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask you how you learned how to sew.
So I learned to sew when I was really young. I can't even really put an age on it. I would say I was somewhere in elementary school. And when I was a kid, we had a sewing machine in our basement that was like built into a table. It was my grandmother's sewing machine. And we also had a cupboard in our basement that we called the craft cupboard. And anytime we were bored, my mom was like, okay, go make something. And so we kind of had free reign of this cupboard, and we'd kind of pull out material or buttons, and it's was always a fun experience to try and just make something. And so my mom let me have basically free reign of this sewing machine and kind of make whatever we wanted to make. And I made a lot of purses and things. I did a lot of like decorating tote bags. I even sold tote bags at a local pharmacy when I was in like middle and high school. I then decided I wanted to make clothing when I was in high school, and my mom taught me how to read a pattern, and I made my first dress. It was a 1950s inspired dress, and I think those that know what I like to sew wouldn't be surprised by that at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of learned by trial and error. My mom taught me the basics of like just threading the machine, and then went from there. I was the one that always got speeding tickets in my high school and middle school home ec classes, because I was like, I already know how to sew. I don't want to sew this piece of paper.
Uh-huh. Now, I want to ask you about a couple things you just talked about. You said your first thing that you did from a pattern was the 1950s inspired dress. And those who know you aren't surprised, but I think we're going to be meeting some new people who are listening to this podcast. So why did you choose this item to create?
So I've always been really inspired by a vintage silhouette, and that's not something that you can find authentically easily in a variety of sizes. And so that style I've always been drawn to. And so I sew a lot of things in that type of style now. But my very first garment pattern from a pattern was a princess seamed full skirt dress that I added like a petticoat underneath. And it was definitely not beginner friendly, but I did it anyway.
I don't think that's surprising, even by people who just met you. Now, you also talked about the craft cupboard, and there is a very special connection from that craft cupboard and you and your grandmother. Would you talk about that?
Yes. So the craft cupboard, when my grandmother passed away before I was born, and all of her crafting supplies my mom inherited, and they all just went into this cabinet. And this cabinet actually lived in my bedroom. And so this craft cupboard had literally anything you can imagine. It seemed like an endless supply of crafting things, from any type of fabric, from like felt to faux fur to quilting cotton, um, any color thread you would need, containers and containers of buttons. There was even like doll parts and things like that. And so it really spiraled into making anything that you would potentially want to make. And so a lot of the things that were in that cupboard, I now have in my sewing room. I use a lot of my grandmother's old supplies and her bias tapes and hem tapes and sewing scissors. I have a lot of them in my sewing room now.
And in relation to that, your grandmother's there every time you sew then?
Yes, she is. My mom always says that it skipped a generation and it went straight to me. So I do a lot of the things that she used to do. And so, yeah, we have that connection without ever having actually met each other, which is really nice.
It is special. That 1950s dress that you made, do you still have that?
I wish I did. I really wish I did. There are pictures somewhere I need to try and find, because I actually wore it. When I was in high school, I was in a creative writing class, and we wrote a dinner theater and performed this dinner theater, and I actually wore it in that play. So there are definitely photos of it. It was a hot pink and lime green color block dress, and it had a like zebra print applique on the skirt. It was a look.
It indeed, indeed, and certainly noticeable. Sarah, let's talk about your blog. You named it the Lilac Elk. Where did you come up with that name?
Yeah, the Lilac Elk was the name that I chose for my Etsy shop when I had opened that. And when I was trying to brainstorm names that could be a business name, could be a blog name, just something that would encompass everything, I settled on the Lilac Elk because it brought in two different places in which I had lived. So at the time, I was living in Rochester, New Hampshire, which is known as the Lilac City. And so that's where the lilac part came from. And then I grew up and lived the majority of my young adult life in Elk County in Pennsylvania. So I combined the two to make the Lilac Elk, and kind of the logo you see with the elk with all the floral inside it. My brother is a graphic designer and had designed that for me. So it just encompassed where I was at the time and where I had been.
It's always interesting to hear inspiration for the name of things. And I think it's more meaningful now that people understand where that came from. Now, in September of 2018, not that long ago, I guess, about 5 years, you learned to knit. What was your inspiration to do that? And tell us about your first project.
Yeah, I mean, when you say, oh, it wasn't that long ago, it really feels like it was just yesterday. I feel like I just learned how to knit. I really wanted to be able to add knitted, vintage inspired pieces to my wardrobe. I had this vision of this like fitted vintage pullover sweater. And so I wanted to knit solely because I wanted to add those things that I didn't feel like I could sew. And I learned to knit. A friend of mine's mother taught me how to cast on and what knit and purl was, in like a 5-minute, let's sit down, I'll just show you how to do this session. And so I practiced a little bit making a couple of things like that were just a rectangle, kind of going back and forth. And my very first project, I actually sewed a couple of those rectangles together and made a sweater. It is not a sweater that I still wear. I don't even know if I still have it. It might be in my frog pile. But once I learned those basics, I really dove right in, and I was like, you know what? I wanted to knit to make this fitted pullover sweater, so that's what I'm going to make. And so the pattern that I used was called the Beauty School Top. It's the Beauty School Top from Poison Grrls, and she does a lot of pin-up vintage inspired knitwear. And I went to a local yarn shop and I asked, hey, can you pick out yarn and needles for me to make this? I'm just going to do it. And so they picked out the yarn and the needles for me because I had no idea what yarn size was, what needle size was. I had no clue what to get. And so they picked everything out, and I just learned one step at a time, watched YouTube videos for everything it told me to do. And it took me a while, but I was really excited about it and it worked out. And I've been knitting basically nonstop ever since.
Do you prefer knitting over sewing or sewing over knitting, or are they equally as important to you?
I feel like they're equally as important. My preference is sewing, because it's more of an instant gratification. It's a lot easier to see a project come together a lot more quickly with sewing. But I love to knit because I don't have to be in my sewing room to do it. I can knit in the car, I can knit on a plane, I can knit while I'm watching TV at night, and I don't have to be kind of locked to my machine to do that. And it also keeps me from snacking while I'm watching TV, which is
there you go. That is a perk. Hey, Sarah, you mentioned your frog pile. What is a frog pile?
Yeah, so in knitting, when you rip the stitches out, it's called frogging. I think because you rip it.
I love that.
And so with knitting, one of the big advantages is you don't actually cut fabric. You don't make things a specific size. You can actually unravel the yarn and it looks like ramen noodles after you do so, but it can be reused again. And so if there's a project that doesn't quite work out, you can always go back.
Interesting. Now, you've mentioned several times in talking about your work, vintage, and you define your style as vintage inspired. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my vintage inspired to me is more of classic, timeless pieces. And so I don't view my style as very trendy. I don't really stay on top of what is in fashion, what's not in fashion. I think that's pretty obvious with the college students that I teach. But I really prefer a kind of high-waisted silhouette. I like a full circle skirt. I like a fitted cropped top to go with those things. And so those kind of timeless pieces are where I try and have my focus. I'm really inspired by the style of Audrey Hepburn, as I think a lot of people are. She just has this kind of classic but casual but dressy when she needs to be sense of style. And I also draw a lot of kind of glamorous inspiration from Elizabeth Taylor. So I have these kind of vintage style icons that really influence what I like to make and what I like to wear. And I've tried to make more of the kind of trendier things in my sewing, and I never find myself actually putting them on. So now I know what types of things I'll reach for. And a lot of people who dress in this kind of vintage style have a very vintage heavy wardrobe where they wear a like circle skirt and a petticoat and a corset and all of that. And I have all of those things in my wardrobe, and I feel like there's definitely a time and place for me in them. I like to dress up and go to car show events and things like that. But it's not what I wear every day, but I try and take those classic pieces and pair it with something a little more modern, like a pair of jeans.
Tell our listeners that there are some wonderful pictures of you in your work online. We'll be talking at the end of this podcast about how people can find these, but I absolutely recommend to them to go online and look at what you have created, because it is the essence of what you're talking about here. And when you
I
describe it,
appreciate that.
and then you see the pictures. There's no question about your style. Now, you were teaching at Pintuck and Purl in Northampton, New Hampshire, and doing just fine. And then the pandemic arrived, and you had to move to online teaching. What was this like, and how is it different than what you were doing? What adjustments did you have to make?
Yeah. So during basically right before the pandemic hit, I had started teaching all of these garment sewing classes at Pintuck and Purl. And Pintuck and Purl is a small yarn and fabric shop. They're actually the ones that picked out my yarn for my first project. And they had me teaching these garment classes, and I had just finished up a coat class, and I had a couple of other classes scheduled. And then when the pandemic came, we had to cancel them.
Mm-hmm.
And we went a couple of, I don't know if it was weeks or months. Everything at that point in time is a blur.
Mm-hmm.
Just waiting to see when we could come back in. And at a certain point, it was like, okay, this isn't changing anytime soon. How can we still teach these classes? And so I decided to try a beginner garment sewing class online, and I offered it through Zoom. And it went really well. People were really receptive to it, and they still could learn anything that I was teaching in person. And so we have really kind of took off from there. And through Pintuck and Purl still, I offer all of these online classes ranging from beginner to advanced. And so with this online teaching, it's a little challenging in terms of I can't touch your project. And so I need to come up with ways to be able to describe how to manipulate the fabric, and if something's not pinned quite right, trying to describe how that needs to be changed. Whereas in person, I could just go and show you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit different in that regard, but it's also really nice because you learn to sew in your own sewing room. You've got all your own supplies. You're really comfortable. You can have your drink. You can have your snack. They're a little bit slower paced because we have classes in between that you can kind of work on things to catch up. And so it provides an environment that's, I think, really nice to those just starting out in garment sewing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to be said for that comfortability of working with your own materials and your own things, and not having to go to a studio to learn how to sew.
So talk about the community, because we all know that when the pandemic arrived, people were pretty sequestered, and you provided an outlet for people who sewed to come together in community from their own studios. And several of the guests that we've had on this podcast have talked about the growth of a community that they didn't even expect, and how they became close and talked about things outside of sewing. And it was really unexpected but wonderful. Did that happen with you?
It definitely did. And honestly, I'm still like in shock that people actually are interested in like learning from me and knowing what I have to say and hearing
Mm-hmm.
what I have to say. It's like all of these people kind of rallied around in, okay, we got a sewing machine to make masks. And now I want to do something else. What else can I do with this? And how can I expand this craft? And the community has grown so much since that. And being able to teach people to sew and create and foster this community has been so wonderful. I
Mm-hmm.
had a few students in that very first class where I taught a beginner top that have taken classes with me repeatedly, and I see them and I've watched their sewing journey grow. And it's people that I may not have met at all, because the classes initially were based in New Hampshire. And so there were those New Hampshire people who took them. Then I moved to Pennsylvania and kept teaching them.
Mm-hmm.
And now there are people from all over that join us. And I've watched them make their first garment. And now we follow each other on Instagram, and I
Mm-hmm.
see what they make from that and how they progress. We just finished a class online where I taught a pair of pants. And so I had a bunch of people who made their first pair of pants with me, and that was so wonderful. Um, Last weekend, I was actually at Pintuck and Purl for an in-person uh, coat making workshop. And so I watched a bunch of people make their first winter coats. And so just
Mm-hmm.
watching these sewists evolve into making these pieces they are so proud of has been so rewarding.
To hear you talk about teaching, it's obvious that you're passionate about it, and you are admittedly so. You talk about this. What is that passion that you have for teaching?
I have kind of always wanted to be a teacher. When I was a kid, that's one of the things that it was like, it was a flight attendant or a teacher, and I definitely went the right route.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that
Very
I
different.
don't know. I don't know how flight attendants do it, because people on planes are at their worst. So with teaching, I have kind of encompassed that in all aspects of my life. And teaching someone to sew, watching them be able to create a three-dimensional thing that they can use every day from a flat piece of fabric, there is nothing more empowering than that. And letting people learn that skill and realize that they have the power to create anything that they want to create is so, so powerful. And I love watching that kind of moment of realization that, oh, I can do this. I can make something, I can create something. And I just, I love it. And I feel like I'll be kind of teaching until I can't do it anymore, you know?
So you teach sewing, but you also teach chemistry at a university. Are they similar? Are they different? Do you see a connection between the two?
There is, they are so similar. And that's weird to say, um, because you wouldn't expect something that seems so different to be so similar. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a very analytical brain, and I'm very systematic about things. I'm very scientific, which is why teaching chemistry works out well for me. But sewing and chemistry both involve a really high level of critical thinking and problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different type of critical thinking and problem solving. You're solving different types of problems, but it's so similar in that you've got to be able to work your way through, and when something doesn't work out, you adapt and pivot. And so I think that teaching chemistry has actually helped improve my sewing teaching ability, in that I can see when things are not going quite right, even over Zoom, and help them solve the problems before they kind of spiral. And so when I teach chemistry and sewing, I kind of take that approach where we don't have to take everything so seriously, and we can adapt and make things better. And sometimes when things don't quite work out, they work out even better the second time. And so, yeah, they involve a lot of the same skills. I
Mm.
actually use sewing and knitting as chemistry examples when I teach math and things like that in my chemistry classes.
Interesting. So we talk about what you do for others, but let's talk about how you curate your wardrobe and maybe a few tips for beginner garment sewists.
Yeah, so I really have spent a lot of time trying to curate my closet so that I'm not making things just to make things. And so that when I do make something, I know it's going to be in a style that I want to wear. And so I have gone through different wardrobe curation classes. I've actually even taught some wardrobe curation classes. And in sewing different things, I've kind of went through this trial and error process to realize what types of silhouettes I like, what types of silhouettes I don't, what types of fabrics I like, and what types of fabric I don't. And it really is that trial and error. It's sometimes things don't work out, but you have to make note of how it didn't work out or why it didn't work out. And so when I was first starting to sew garments, I had a kind of streak of misses. I made things that were very popular that I thought looked so cute on everyone else. And I made it for myself and I was like, okay, I don't like this anymore. And those garments all had a common thread. They were all boxier. I used maybe fabrics that I didn't quite like the feel of. And so now I know that there are certain substrates that even if I like the garment, I'm not going to like it on my body. I don't like the way it feels. It might make me sweat or it might be itchy. And so through that process, I know, okay, I do not sew with these substrates. And I know that there are certain silhouettes that, as cute as they look on everyone else, you're not going to like that when it's in your own closet. And so I now have that really fine-tuned silhouette and also color palette that works really well together. So a lot of my pieces can now be mixed and matched, where there's probably not a lot of tops in my closet that wouldn't pair with every single one of my pair of pants. A lot of people who have watched me sew and watched me grow in this know what my color palette is. The people who shop with me for fabric know, like, oh, that's a Sarah fabric. She's going to want this. And so if it's jewel toned or leopard print or black, I'm probably going to like it.
Okay. So that's a Sarah piece of fabric.
That's a Sarah piece of fabric for sure. And with knowing those things, you can create a wardrobe that's going to last and that's going to really fine tune your style. And I think that this sewing exploration is a really great way to do that. It's a really fun way to kind of build your closet and realize what types of things you like to wear and what types of things you don't. With the kind of curation of color and patterns, I tend to, if I want to try a new color or a new pattern on a garment, I will use a sewing pattern that I know I love. So I've got a blouse pattern that I wear all the time that I really, really like. I want to try this real bright fabric. I'm going to make the silhouette, so I'm only changing one variable at a time. That's where chemistry comes into this too.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes it so I have a lot less misses when I sew something.
I like that your test and learn approach or trial and error you call sewing exploration. And it sounds like that's your words of wisdom for beginner garment sewists or people who just want to try things out. It's okay to do something and not like it.
It absolutely is. And it's so important to not take yourself too seriously when you're sewing. It is just fabric. And nothing bad's going to happen if it doesn't work out. I always tell people to make what you want to make and don't worry about that difficulty level. So patterns have that kind of, oh, this is recommended for an advanced beginner sewist. Am I really advanced beginner next? And I tell people not even to pay attention. Don't worry about what the level is, because if you are making something you actually want to make, you will finish it. You will watch a video to learn a certain technique. You will learn every step of the way, and you will grow so much in doing so. And so what if it's not perfect? And so what if it doesn't work out perfectly every single time? It's okay, because you'll learn with every step anyway.
What inspires you these days?
I am weirdly really inspired by vintage furniture and wallpaper.
Okay.
We are in the process of building a home right now, and so I'm doing a lot of kind of making mood boards of paint color and wallpaper, and looking at vintage furniture. So that's what a lot of like my Pinterest is right now. And so I think that I kind of take a lot of those inspirations into my garment making too. I'm looking at a lot of these like really saturated dark floral prints and wallpaper, and so now I really want dresses like that too.
So you'll coordinate with your home.
Yes, coordinate with my home. My style and my home palette are one and the same.
And now you can coordinate your husband too. Now you can work on his clothes.
See, he doesn't like me to sew for him, so it works out because I can sew for myself. Yeah, he always says that he doesn't want me to make him things because he's very picky and he is afraid that he won't like it, and he doesn't want to tell me he doesn't like it. So he just says, "You can make it for yourself. You don't have to make anything for me."
That makes sense. I'm very smart. Very smart. Sarah, what's next for you? What's your dream?
My dream is to make more people passionate about sewing. And so my next steps in terms of this community journey are to just offer more classes and more workshops to get people learning to sew. And so I've got a slew of virtual classes on the docket to work on next, but I've also got a lot of really fun kind of secret events coming up that I'll be teaching at in person too. So I'm really excited where the next little bit will take this teaching journey.
It's a lot of things to look forward to. We talked about many things, very diverse topics today. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
You know what, Meg? You would really just cover everything. I feel like you're very thorough.
Well, you have a lot to share, a lot of wonderful stories about, what inspires you, how you got to where you are, and your love for sharing this with the sewing community. And I have to tell you, Sarah, this has just been a fun conversation, and I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Well, thank you for letting me share it. I hope that this inspires someone to learn to sew garments if they haven't already.
Well, and on that note, if our listeners would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at the Lilac Elk. TheLilacElk.com is also my website, and I'm on Facebook under that too, although I don't post there as often. I also teach all of my classes, whether virtually or in-person workshops, through Pintuck and Purl. And so you can find those announcements if you sign up for their email newsletter.
Wonderful. Sarah, thank you again. We'll look forward to those upcoming events, surprises that you have, and future pictures of your new home.
Oh, thank you so much, Meg. It was such a nice conversation. So nice to talk to you.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you. Someone for whom sewing and quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life. It's a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or just complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.